Hello, everybody. This is going to be a brief recap of everything we went over in the council meeting, the first council meeting of 2024. So, in this council meeting, we went over the potential that Minster has to be a leader in cycling infrastructure in pretty much all of Western Ohio. So, a reason that this infrastructure, as a reminder, could be necessary for our town is in part due to our children and how a car-dependent infrastructure really limits how children can get around our town. So through that, we can look at our safe routes to school data. We see that we have about 20% of our students walking, but this is really only if they're within about half a mile of school, and even less of our child population is biking to school. And you can see a majority of our students are taken to school in some form of vehicle, which is okay, but this really limits children's ability to have independence and explore our town. So this kind of coins the term the backseat generation. These generation of kids whose only option to get around town is by car. And a lot of parents, if you have kids, you might have experienced this through feeling like you're a chauffeur and just shuttling your kids around from destination to destination. So a few things that stick out in the safe routes to school data. This biking percentage, how this is at about 10%. I'll touch on that again later about why that's important. So going down here, a few more important things to note. So we see this is a separation of kids biking to school and compared to the distance. So walk, bike, and depending on what distance they are. So all the way closest to school, you can see we have a lot of kids walking. That makes sense if it's right there next to school. So we have a lot of kids walking here. And after about a half a mile, our walking percentages really start to drop off. And once it goes over half a mile, less than 10% of kids are walking. And then over a mile, pretty much nobody. And our biking, our highest percentage is at 20-ish. So not bad, but it's still because it's so close to school. And I'll show you why this walking distance matters. I'll touch on that in a little bit and how these bike numbers should really be higher, if not 20% throughout every distance except for the greater than 2 miles. I also wanted to touch on a reason why these percentages are alarming is going down here we can see the percentage of kids who are asking to walk who have asked for permission to walk or bike to or from school. So you can see by distance within a quarter mile, nearly 80% of kids, 70% of kids. That takes a hit between half a mile and a mile, but still at about 50%. And even 1 to 2 miles, it's over 60%. Now, as expected, you can see over 2 miles, not many people are going to want to walk and bike anymore. Now, this is specifically alarming because the only percentage that really comes close to hitting that matches the amount of kids who are asking for permission is our quarter mile here with the walking because we have that good walking infrastructure. You can see maybe our quarter mile to a half hits close at about 50%, so that's closer. But you can see once we get above half a mile to a mile, we have kids asking at over 60%, but kids aren't doing it. And so that leads me to the point to it being an infrastructure problem. So now pair my intuition with what parents are saying. So you can see distance is a huge concern for a lot of parents. And at the top here, this is children, let's see, who do not walk to school or bike yet. And this is decisions of parents affecting children to walk or bike to school if they already do so. So we can see distance is a very high contributor to both. But in my mind, I'll touch on it a little bit how it may not be distance, but just the amount of unsafe intersections. So we can see traffic along the route, the safety of intersections, the speed, and it's the same thing down here with traffic, speed, intersections, just not feeling safe while going to school are all huge factors of whether children are allowed to walk or bike from school. So here we can see our catchment areas, and we have a pin started at the school. So the red outline is our walking distance. So this is about a half mile that we saw that kids are willing to walk to and from school. And now this is because we have great walking infrastructure. We have great sidewalks. So it makes sense that we would see children walking what studies show people are comfortable walking, which is about half a mile. So you can see this only really covers the northwest quadrant of town, and this whole south side of the town is left out from being able to walk to school. So, in contrast to this walking area, we can see in green our biking catchment area. So, if you live within this outline and have safe cycling infrastructure, it's reasonable to assume that they would bike to school. Now, the problem is that we don't have any safe biking infrastructure in the town of Minster or most of the MAC towns or pretty much any town in Western Ohio. The only bit of safe cycling infrastructure we have is actually the canal, which runs up here. So you can see how this doesn't really help any kids to get to school or pretty much do anything besides provide a way for people to have a little bit of recreation. So that's part of the reason why sidewalks are great, but bike infrastructure should be what we're really focusing on in getting people to school. Now, sometimes people say, well, the streets are safe and people should be able to cycle on our streets because they're low speed and low volume. So that makes me, next I'm going to bring up this graph here. So what this graph shows, or what this little infographic shows, is how many people will feel comfortable using a piece of bike infrastructure. So you'll see that right away this doesn't add up to 100%, and that's because there's a portion of the population that is just never going to bike, and that's okay. But we do have a large portion of the population that will bike if they have separated bike infrastructure. So everything we have now in Minster can fall under these four examples here. You're either directly on the road, maybe riding on the shoulder, and we don't have any bike lanes, but I would consider our low volume roads to be in this category here. So like I said earlier with the bike infrastructure or the safe routes to school cycling data, how that's important. So if we take the minimum here from these two, we'd expect 5 plus 4, maybe 9% to a maximum of maybe 18% to be bicycling based on Minster's current infrastructure. So if we go back to our safe routes to school, we can see our cycling was right in the middle of that at 11%. So it's pretty much exactly what we would expect to see based off the infrastructure that we offer here in Minster. Now, I just want to touch on, it is possible to change. There are schools around the US that have been working to change, and we can see in pictures here that I'm about to pull up, we can see there's a school in Texas that has developed a bike lane in front of their school, and they saw a considerable jump in the amount of students who biked. They would see upwards of hundreds of students biking to school every day. Now, this is that same school. What you can see here is a bike bus where they have two volunteers. If there's any kids who feel unsure or they're not courageous enough, or maybe not courageous, they don't feel comfortable enough riding to school on their own yet. There's these volunteers in what's called a bike bus, where these volunteers can go in the front and back, and they'll help corral kids to school. So that way, the kids feel safe, and it really is safer because as a driver, if you see this whole pack of students, you're going to slow down. You're going to be much more cautious, as opposed to one kid maybe accidentally darting across the street. So you can see how this adds to the safety. Now, along with these schools trying to make change, we also have the benefit of e-scooters, and e-bikes are becoming very popular. So if you haven't seen this before, this is a type of e-scooter with the batteries in the stem here, and then there's a motor in this wheel, making it very easy to get around town. Now you can see another picture here of this is an e-bike with a battery and motor assisted, and there's a nice carriage for a group of children. It's a little pixelated, it's not very high definition, but you can see there's carriage of kids so they can hop in and they can be shuttled around town. Same with this e-bike here. This is electrically assisted, which makes it very easy to take almost a whole family around town. So dropping off at school, to go to the park to enjoy the town. This adds a whole new layer of enjoyment and just not having to rely on a car, especially if you're trying to cut some cost as a family. Now that we know that change is possible, I think it's also important to frame the idea of this change. So if we're looking for change in Minster, the pillars for a successful bike network is safety, comfort, directness, cohesion, and attractiveness. So safety, people aren't going to use it if it's not safe. And this goes for the weakest link principle. If there's one intersection that isn't safe along the network, people aren't going to use it. Now, comfort, this involves a smooth path that isn't very bumpy. And this also involves limiting the start-stop points. For example, if you rode a bike from the south side of Minster to the north side, and you also had to stop at every intersection along the way, this would effectively double the distance that you would have to cycle to get across Minster. You can see how important that comfort pillar is to a bike network. Third is directness. So I want to be able, if I'm a child, to go from my house to school and from school back. I don't want to take a large detour. Now, the next one would be cohesion. So if I'm at school, I have to be able to go to the park and I have to be able to go from the park to school. That all has to be within the network. And then the last pillar is attractiveness. So it has to be a comfortable place, an attractive place to cycle with gardens and trees. It can't just be an open field. As particularly here, I think this is a bad example of attractiveness. You just got rocks, a tiny little water canal, and some dirt field. So keep that in mind and how different the attractiveness level is when you get into the woods up here on the canal path. So with all of this in mind, it's we can start dreaming about or coming up with ideas about what a potential bike network would look like in Minster. So with what I was saying earlier about how the percentage of people that would bike on a road is very low compared to the amount of people that would bike on a separated path. Well, that also goes for, it depends on the street type. So there's one thing that stands out very clearly in Minster. In contrast to the streets, we have our alleys. Now, these alleys are inherently low speed and are basically bike paths already. So you can see how these alleys are naturally inviting to cyclists. Now, in other countries, the Dutch have coined the term cycle street, which in their language is called Fietsstraat. So we can look at some examples for them. You can see how this is similar towards the alley, but they've really made it clear that this is a place for bikes and cars are welcome as guests on this street. So you can see the addition of speed bumps and red asphalt to really show that this is a place for bikes and you in a car, you're only welcome there as a guest. It's a privilege. Some more examples, you can see speed bumps again in the iconic red asphalt along with a sign that translates into cars are guest. So you can see the bikes are using here and they're the main users of this infrastructure, but the cars are still allowed. And just one last picture here to see the bikes being the main user here. So we can see how similar these these cycle streets are compared to our alleys. They're narrow, people drive slowly on them, about 15 miles an hour, which is very safe for bikes and cars to intermix. So now, okay, this is one idea for our bike network. We can see how the alleys could possibly play into this, but are people using them? So we can look and see, are people actually using these alleys? Now, the first little bit of evidence I want to show you is Strava. This is an app where people can use to track their workouts. So you can see using Strava when people are recreating in this town. One thing I want to note right off the bat, let's see, I think this red shows it a little bit clearer. One thing I'd like to note right off the bat is how little people walk on 119 and 66. This is just a testament to how much through traffic erodes our sense of place and how people really don't want to be in these places where are treated as a thoroughfare. And you can definitely see it's people only travel through. People don't like to spend time here, especially when you're outside of a car. So moving forward on the possible bike network. So as I was touching with earlier, you can see that people stick to what they perceive as the low traffic routes. You can see a lot of people like to walk on the track in the park here. But in particular, you can see how widely used this alley is when people are going for a walk or a bike ride because it's a pleasant experience. You have this nice canal here with people's backyards. It's very enjoyable and it gives you a direct connection all the way up and over to the canal path, which is what a lot of people use for a bike ride or a good walk. Now, another piece of evidence. So that was with recreation. So in my mind, it makes sense to put it over here. But let's look at another alley in particular, this alley that ends up feeding right into the school. So if we go into Street View here on Google, we can see this Street View was taken on a summer day. So what we can see here is we can see, whoops, go back here a little bit. We can see how trampled down the grass is here. right across from this alley. So in my mind, this makes me think that a lot of children, a lot of people are using this alley and crossing here to go straight to the pool. And I think it would be safe to say that a lot of kids would be doing this in the school time too, when people are going to the school. So that's one more bit of evidence to show that our alleys are being used as walking paths and cycling paths, even though we haven't done anything to encourage them to be used in that manner. Now, if we were to really lean into this and to start developing our paths in a way to promote cycling and walking, not just to be used as a symptom. Maybe not a symptom, but people are using that when they're not designed like that. So how do we start to design these alleys as walking and cycling paths? Well, we can follow an iterative approach. We can start with step one, identify where people struggle when going about their daily routine or their daily travels. Step two, we can identify the smallest thing that can be done today to address that struggle. Three, we can do that thing and do it right away. And four, we repeat the process. So identifying where people struggle. So looking at this and what we saw in some previous pictures, one place to struggle, one place to note is that people do not like riding on 7th Street here. It's really wide and people can really fly through this. Now that we have three child-oriented places here, and it's unfortunate that these places are on a street that is not conducive to cycling. So right off the bat, we can start here. And what we can do is develop a similar approach to what other schools have done and do the on-street bike path here. As we saw earlier in those pictures with the bike path, we can imagine if we have a bike path on 7th Street, this would provide two effects. One, it would narrow down the road, making cars go much slower through here. With only 10-foot wide travel lanes, it's a lot more uncomfortable to drive in a car, so you slow down. And the next positive thing we have out of this is when people are walking to school, now they only have to cross about 20 feet of car traffic as opposed to the full 30 foot length, 30 foot width of this road section here. And I can show some more pictures to give this a demonstration. If we look at 7th Street today, we have our nice big front yards, and we have these wide travel lanes, these big 15-foot lanes, which makes speeding very easy on 7th Street, and it makes it uncomfortable to ride on a bike. So moving forward, we can see if we narrow down these travel lanes to 10 foot, that is required by the Ohio Department of Transportation, what we have left is about 10 feet for separated bike infrastructure. So now, as we saw in those pictures, now we can have a two-way cycle path where kids can go from the school to the park and ride up and down this road safely. So, like I said, two benefits to where the cars slow down, pedestrians don't have to cross as many car lanes. So, you're crossing a bike lane, which is a lot safer to intermix pedestrians and bikes while crossing. So, those are the effects that we could imagine 7th Street to be. So, exiting back out here, we can see that's just one part of the equation. So now we have our school, pool, and park connected, all with this on-street bike path here. But now what about the rest of the town? So using the alleys, like I said earlier, this is a real strength that Minster has that no other town in Western Ohio can claim, is that we pretty much have bike paths going through our town already. So I'll highlight one alley in particular here. If we can see how this alley goes through numerous people's backyards. So if there's any children along this route, they can hop on the alley and go directly to school. So addressing our pillars for a good bike network. So first we have safety. As we can see, it's safe because cars are traveling slowly down the alley and it's disconnected from the main places that cars will travel. The next thing we have to address is comfort, which if you've ever ridden on our alleys, you will know at these intersections here, it does get a little uncomfortable going up and down these curbs, and I will touch on that in a little bit about what we can do to address that. So just going over our alley, you can see one big conflict point here too, with the intersection of 4th Street. Being a very high volume street, this is going to need a little more nuance and thought about how to approach it. and this is just my quick idea here, is if you could route this path back over the street and utilize the traffic signal that's already here at this intersection. You can give children and residents alike a safe way to cross and then get back to the alley bike path. Now this allows a direct route for everybody on this west side of town directly to the pool, directly to the park, and directly to school. So you can see how this could be a minimum network needed for at least a portion of the town. So now let's go over a few of those things. So as I was talking about earlier with identifying where people struggle. So if we were to really utilize this alley as an artery in our bike network, people would struggle one with the safety of these intersections. So the safety and comfort of having to stop and wait at these intersections would be a huge detriment to our cycling network. So what can we do today? What are some minimum changes we can do? As we were touching on earlier, narrowing down the street really slows down how fast cars will go on that street. So if we take that in consideration, we can narrow our street down as we see here. So in these yellow lines, you can imagine uh, flex posts or flexible bollards. So I'll pull a picture up here. So this is one idea where you can put these flex posts. It doesn't have to be a grand, giant infrastructure change that costs thousands and thousands of dollars. This is a cheap way to get people out there. This is a way to iterate, to start with what works first, then upgrade as you go. So using these flex posts as a guide, we can limit traffic. So we can constrain traffic down. So that way it influences people to go slower through here. Now, along with this constrainment, you can add speed bumps that I have here in black. So what these speed bumps do, they will slow people down and drastically increase the rate in which drivers will yield to cyclists going along the alleys. So you can see here how if we constrain this this surface for cars and squeeze them down with speed bumps, now it's much more likely as a car driving through, you're going to stop and let the cyclist pass. So those are a few things we can do to the street. Now also, I mentioned comfort. Like I said, if you've driven here, you know these curbs aren't that comfortable on the bike. They're pretty bumpy. So what is the minimum possible thing we can do right now to make this workable? This is just one idea of something that can at least be done now to smoothen it out instead of waiting for a giant infrastructure change that smooths out this connection with the road. So you can imagine this being done to where the alley meets the road here. Now, another thing to go along with making this intersection safe, because this is a residential street, through traffic is very uncomfortable. People living on this road don't like through traffic. That is one of the reasons why cul-de-sacs, for example, such as out here, are very popular in much of America. You have the added convenience of not having any through traffic because there's nowhere for people to go. Now, this is the benefit of Minster maintaining their grid, is that we can recreate a cul-de-sac but make it good for walking and biking. So as you can see with a cul-de-sac, cars can't drive through, but also walking and biking becomes much less convenient. If you were to go from this cul-de-sac just a little bit over here on the road, you'd have to walk and bike all the way around to get over. You can see how this is nice that it keeps cars out, but it also has the same effect of making walking and biking much more difficult. Now on our roads here, we can imagine making a sort of cul-de-sac for cars, but it's called a modal filter. So I'll highlight a new thing here. So you can see in red, if we blocked off the roads here, I'll give a quick picture as an example. So here's an example of a modal filter attached to the road. So you can see cars parked on both ends, but you can't drive through the street. Now it makes it also very easy for cyclists to go through the street, which is key, as you can see the cycling symbols here. So if we put these here, what this would do would be drastically limit the amount of people that would ever drive over this intersection in their car. As you can see here on this block, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 homes that would ever need to cross this intersection here, making it orders of magnitude safer for cyclists crossing the street here. Now we can also do that for this intersection here to limit the amount of cars that drive through here and here's only 4 houses that would ever cross. So there'd be a very low amount of cars that would ever be crossing this bike path now, while still allowing bicyclists and walkers to pass through as needed. Now we all may also ask, okay, but what about all of these houses? Where will the through traffic go if they can no longer drive through these red portions here? Well, they will be funneled probably to 7th Street or 4th Street. Now in 7th Street, like I said, this is good because we have our bike path here. So even if that through traffic is being funneled over to 7th Street, now we have a safe distinction between cars and bikes. We have different areas for them. Now, along with 4th Street is another place that they could funnel, which could maybe be upgraded in future iterations or future generations. But for right now, I think it's a good point that it's okay to have this through traffic funneled here as long as we have this separate bike infrastructure on 7th Street. It's good to remember that a lot of these upgrades are the minimum possible thing we can do now. So it's good to get these upgrades in now to see how the people react before we make these giant infrastructure investments into maybe something more aesthetically pleasing, or instead of speed bumps and plastic posts, we have actual steel posts and concrete curbs, which are much more expensive. Now, it's also a benefit that all of these upgrades are temporary if need be. If they're installed and the community doesn't like it, they're easily removed and swapped out. So, in a place where we're dreaming about the future, we can give an idea of what this could look like one day. So, with our intersections of the alley, for example, could look something like this, where the cyclists on the alley have a smooth transition all the way through. And it's very clear if you're operating a motor vehicle that you are to yield, that the cyclists have priority here. You have speed bumps on both ends to slow down cars, and the cyclists feel safe when they cross this. That's also important to note that in our iteration in Minster, cars will also be able to use the alley if they lived along that alley. But there's no reason to use that alley with the streets being as good as they are for cars. This would only be necessary to access if you lived anywhere back here. But it would be very apparent that you were a guest here and not the main user. Now, if we were talking minimum steps, the absolute first steps we can take in this journey, it's important to look at where our truck routes are. So I'll highlight over here. This is the current truck routes in Minster. You can see we have 66 and 119. Now, one thing that really stands out to me is that when we talked about our 3 popular locations, the school, the pool, and the park, we have a truck route along this route. Now we can also see the truck routes throughout town being able to funnel trucks to where they need to be throughout town. So I think it's definitely plausible to at the very least remove 7th Street from its truck route designation. What this will allow us to do is narrow down the roads and add the necessary infrastructure to decrease the speed on this road and increase safety for the children and to make a new bike path here. So that could be our very first step, is removing this truck route on 7th Street. Now, I think it's amazing that Minster really does have a unique position to be a leader, a pioneer in cycling infrastructure in all of Western Ohio. I hope in this video I've done a good job of bringing up some of the ideas why Minster is so special, why Minster is so unique, and that we already have bike paths woven into our urban fabric. Now, it's going to take a lot of courage to take some space back from cars, but as we can see, looking at this overview of Minster, we've already dedicated all of our space to cars. Most of our public space goes to cars. And anywhere you say, for example, cross the street, it's apparent that you're entering a space for cars. It will take courage, but I think we can set a good example about how infrastructure changes like this can make a huge impact for our children in just a few points, giving priority away from cars and towards cyclists. So I hope this has been a good recap of what was discussed at the council meeting and to give a good idea or a good understanding of the possible bike network that could exist here in Minster.